Joining me at the desk is Treasurer Jim Chalmers. Jim Chalmers, thank you for joining me. A big day for you, but let's start with the big story out of this budget, and that is electricity prices up 20% this year, 30% next year. Did you consider direct relief in terms of the power prices?
Oh, look, obviously when you've got power price increases forecast like that, you consider a range of options. We do understand that electricity prices are a bigger and bigger part of our inflation challenge. That's been true actually since the energy price rises that were hidden by our predecessors during the election campaign. So we've got a big challenge here. And what I've been saying today, including to yourself earlier, was that if we need to consider further steps, particularly on the regulatory side, then I think any responsible government would explore them.
Are you talking about a cap on prices?
I will have more to say about it. Obviously I want to work closely with colleagues on this. First of all, it's important we get more renewable energy in the system because that's cheaper, cleaner, more reliable. We have to recognise there's big pressure on energy prices from the war in Ukraine, not helping. And a decade of getting energy policy wrong hasn't helped either. And so when you consider all that and add all of that up, Australians are paying a price for all of that. And so any responsible government would consider whether more can be done on the regulatory side, and that's what we'll do.
And just for clarity though, are we talking price caps, or how do you put a regulatory intervention in this space?
Well, one of the reasons why we need to be careful about this is because the state governments control a lot of the regulation when it comes to energy markets. And because this is primarily an East Coast problem, we would need to work closely with state governments. But we have already flagged, including today, that we've got work to do here. I'm not prepared to preempt one option or another, but we have pretty clearly said, in addition to getting more renewables into the system, which is our overarching objective, if there are other steps we can take in the interim, I think personally, when energy prices are price rises are projected to be this substantial, then you probably need to consider a range of options not previously considered.
And when you look at this sort of impact and people already hurting with interest rates and so on, did you seriously look at that cost of living potential? And I know what happened with the Trust budget, the Liz Truss budget. We know what happened in reaction to that. But was there any consideration to say, can we provide some sort of payment and not be inflationary? Yeah,
well, the primary influence on the budget was inflation, and that's why we've gone out of our way to deliver a budget which is responsible and right for the times, because we've got this inflation problem. It is partly electricity, but it's also the upward pressure on grocery prices from natural disasters, particularly flooding. It's also all the issues in supply chains and all of the rest of it. So inflation was the primary influence on the budget, and we are providing a heap of cost of living relief, but in a way that isn't inflationary. So when we sat around the Expenditure Review Committee table to work out what cost of living relief we could provide, we decided on $7.5 billion in cost of living relief, but focused in areas where there was an economic dividend, where it wasn't a cheque in the mail, but where it was another thing, childcare.
But a lot of families miss out, don't they? There will be a lot of people out there that miss out, and they're going to hurt even more as a result. That must weigh on you.
Of course. But we've got a heap of cost of living relief in there, and in addition to that, $33 billion in extra pensions and payments because of the indexation to try and keep up with these costs of living, minimum wage rises, all of these different ways. Our efforts in housing are important and new today around the Housing Accord. All of these efforts are really important. We know Australians are doing it tough. We don't want to make that worse by adding to inflation, which is the primary challenge that people are dealing with around the kitchen table. That's why tonight's budget is so responsible and so restrained.
Is it just time to shelve the election promise of reducing power bills by $275?
Well, first of all,
that's not going to happen now.
Well, first, it remains the case that renewable energy is not just cleaner energy, it's also cheaper energy. That is the truth. So that remains the case. Since that modelling was released, of course, there have been a lot of things happen, including a war in Europe, which is the primary determinant of these higher electricity prices. And lastly, we would be in a much, much better position if we hadn't had a decade of stuffing up energy policy in this country, where capacity has been pulled out of the system rather than added to the system, and that's made us more vulnerable to these sorts of shocks that we're seeing in energy markets.
What do you say to the argument that you've identified the illness but not the cure, that you've given us the problem but not the solution?
I don't accept that for a moment. I mean, the the solution to energy which is unreliable and too expensive
But I'm saying
is more renewable.
in broader budget terms, you've
I
said
don't
that we've
accept
got
for a
this
second.
structural problem,
Yeah.
hard decisions. Where are the hard
Kieran,
decisions?
it has been a long time since a government has put forward $22 billion of savings, $28.5 billion of budget improvements. We're banking for 2 years 99% of the temporary surge in revenue from higher commodity prices. Our predecessors were doing 40%. We're doing 99%, letting that go back into the budget to rebuild our buffers against this global uncertainty. That is really important, that restraint. What defines this budget and distinguishes it from the ones that my predecessor handed down is responsibility and restraint. And while it does that, it also readies us for a better future.
But you talk about this conversation we've got to have, and I think that's a lot of people are listening. They're saying, okay, so what's the conversation?
Well,
where do we have to go?
I am really heartened by the appetite in the Australian community for real talk about our challenges, and tonight we started dealing with them. Savings, spending restraint, redirecting money away from wasteful spending into more productive spending. This is exactly the start that we need. Now, this term of Parliament will have 3, maybe 4 budgets. We've always encouraged people to see tonight as the beginning of a more responsible approach to the budget and not the end. And so I think inevitably, and in welcome ways, we should be having a conversation, because we've done a lot of good work in the budget in the near term by showing that restraint. The budget position deteriorates over time because of these persistent structural spending pressures, and we can't ignore them.
In the budget lockup, you said that you'd be willing to make some moves in terms of that conversation you're talking about in tax or cuts this term. What sort of thing is on your radar?
Well, I think that's
Can
just
you bring
common
the
sense.
Australian people into confidence on that?
I think it's common sense to say we're not just going to do some budget repair in the first budget, but not the second, third and maybe fourth budgets of the term. I think it's just common sense to acknowledge that when you've got these structural issues in the budget that we inherited, $1 trillion of debt, deficits as far as the eye can see, and a big structural deficit, then there's no point just hitting the pause button after the first budget. We've got more work to do. We've flagged that for some time. We'll involve Australians in that conversation.
In the conversation, but do you recognise some of the bigger changes might well necessitate a mandate, i.e. you'd have to take it to an election?
Well, I think that there is more work to be done this parliamentary term. I've just handed down the first budget a little while ago. So, we just got that one done and dusted. The hard work on the next one begins probably tomorrow or sometime soon after that. We've got a lot of work to do in the budget, but we made important steps tonight, and some of the discipline and some of the restraint and the responsibility that we showed tonight would be unrecognisable to our predecessors.
On the housing accord, just for those viewers who might be tuning in, explain to us how that works, because it involves superannuation, building industry and government. Is it for home buyers or for renters?
Well, it is largely for renters. It's about making sure that there's more housing supply at cheaper rents near where the jobs and opportunities are. The big problem in our economy is we've had these jobs being created, and it's harder and harder for people to be able to afford to live near them. We've got vacancy rates extremely low. We've got rents extremely high. We've got a policy for social housing. We've got a policy for Help to Buy. This sits somewhere in the middle, and it brings people together. Super. It brings states and local governments together. It brings the building industry together to see if we can shift the needle and build more affordable homes.
On net debt, there's a significant improvement in this budget. Can we avoid hitting that $1 trillion mark in net debt?
Oh no, we'll still be hitting the $1 trillion. The trajectory that existed at the time when governments changed hands has us very firmly on a trajectory to $1 trillion in debt, but there is less debt in this budget over the forward estimates than there was in the pre-election fiscal outlook. That's because we've returned so much of that upward surge in revenue to the budget. That means we've got less debt in the budget over the forward estimates, but we've got more to show for it.
On, finally, one issue that doesn't get a lot of coverage, but I want to ask you about it. You've committed $1.4 billion over 4 years to overseas development assistance, foreign aid. That is a significant increase, but does it reverse the decline of recent years, or is more needed in that space in your view?
Oh, well, it's an important start at least. I mean, this is not a small amount of money, and it couldn't come at a more important time. And you watch the foreign policy situation very closely. Our region is an uncertain place. We want to be the partner of choice for our Pacific friends. The region needs us to invest in it in meaningful ways, and that's what the commitment tonight is.